Apes, and welcome to screencast number 7 on Chapter 7, Environmental Policy, Making Decisions and Solving Problems. So we've talked primarily about the United States, and one of the things that we mentioned in the U.S. is that we couldn't just restrict to the borders. And the same thing happens with environmental problems across the globe. They are not restricted by national borders. What happens in one country, like whatever's going on in the United States, we're also impacting the climate and whatever's happening in China and India and in Europe and Asia and in Russia and the USSR and all those countries, the Soviet Union and all of that. So we've got to take that into consideration as well. So there is an international law that is known as the customary law, and this arises from a long-standing practice or customs that are held in common by most cultures. It is contrasted with an international law known as the conventional law that arises from conventions or treaties. And these have been written contracts among nations into which the nations enter, they sign. One example is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which in 1994 was a treaty that established a framework for agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that contributed to the global climate change. Another one that you might have heard of before is the Kyoto Protocol. And a protocol is actually an amendment or an addition to a convention. And this later specified or agreed upon the details of the emission limits. Another example would be the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and its subsequent Montreal Protocol, which is set to reduce the emission of airborne chemicals that deplete the ozone layer. As an example of the different conventional laws that have come up, 180 countries have signed the Kyoto Agreement to this date. And we know that we were trying to sign the Paris Treaty, but our current administration backed out of that. Here we can see on this data table the convention or the protocol that has been done in the years that it's been done and when it's been ratified and whether it's been signed or not signed. We've also had treaties that we mentioned, such as the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol, that are truly global in scope and have been ratified by most of the world's nations. Treaties have also been signed among pairs or groups of nations. For example, the United States and Mexico and Canada entered into the North America Free Trade Agreement. You might know that as NAFTA, NAFTA. This was in 1994, and NAFTA eliminated trade barriers such as tariffs on imports and exports to make goods cheaper for everyone. But NAFTA also undermined protection of workers and the environment. So there were problems with that, but that Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. still worked together to negotiate and try to address those concerns. NAFTA's impacts on jobs and on environmental quality in the three nations have been complex and far-reaching, so you can imagine that they're still trying to work on those. So here's a picture of people that are working. This is manufacturing that's happening in Mexico in the garment factory. Wages are lower. The health and environmental regulations are much more relaxed, and when we think of how NAFTA affected this, the impacts on the jobs and the environmental quality have been mixed. You're going to want to buy cheaper clothes that are made by the people in Mexico, but yet you might not want to buy them because we know that the work conditions aren't regulated as well. There have been international organizations that try to influence the environmental policies through funding and peer pressure and media attention. So we look at the United Nations, which was founded in 1945, and it includes representatives from all nations of the world, and its purpose is to seek to develop and maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to cooperate in solving international economic, social, and cultural and humanitarian problems, and in promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of the nations in attaining these ends. It is headquartered in the United States. It plays an active role in shaping international environmental policy by sponsoring conferences and treaties and publishing the research. There is an agency within the United Nations called the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and this promotes sustainability with research and outreach activities that provide information to policymakers and scientists throughout the world. So that's the role of that group. We also have the World Bank, and this was established in 1944, and it's based in Washington, D.C. It's one of the largest sources of funding for economic development. It too helps to shape environmental policy through its funding of dams and irrigation, infrastructure, and other major development projects. Its fiscal year in 2012, it provided $35 billion in loans and support for projects that were designed to benefit the poorest people in the poorest country. It does have a good mission, but it's frequently been criticized for funding unsustainable projects that cause more environmental problems than they solve, such as dams that flood valuable forest and farmlands in order to provide electricity, or providing for the needs of the growing human populations in poor nations while minimizing the damage of environmental systems on which people depend. And this winds up being a very tough balancing act. The next is the European Union, or the EU, and the European Union seeks to promote Europe's unity and its economic and social progress. And this also includes environmental protection. Its job is to assert Europe's role in the world, and it can sign binding treaties on behalf of its 27 member nations, and it can also enact regulations that have the same authority as national laws. It can also issue directives. But typically these directives are more advisory in nature. The European Environment Agency addresses waste management and noise pollution, water pollution and air pollution, habitat degradation, and natural hazards, and it seeks to remove trade barriers among member nations. It has classified some nations as environmental regulations as barriers to the trade, saying that they cannot trade with them. And it also puts in stricter environmental laws into effect. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, you've heard of this before. This is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and it represents multinational corporations, and it's there to promote free trade. It helps to reduce obstacles to international commerce, and it enforces fairness among nations and trading practices. It has the authority to impose financial penalties on nations that do not comply with the directives, and these penalties can sometimes affect environmental policy. So when we look at the European Union and the World Trade Organization, they really interpret some of the national environmental laws as unfair barriers to the trade. In 1995, the U.S. EPA, as an example, issued regulations requiring cleaner burning gasoline. Congress made amendments to the Clear Act. Brazil and Venezuela filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization saying that the new rules discriminated against the petroleum they were exporting to the U.S. and did not burn because it did not burn as cleanly. So the World Trade Organization agreed, and it ruled that even through the South American gasoline posed a threat to the United States and the health of humans in the U.S., the EPA rules were illegal trade barrier, and it forced the United States to weaken its regulations. So that's how the World Trade Center can work. There are non-government organizations, NGOs, and these, there's a number of them. They have become international in scope and exert influence over international policies. They're diverse in their size and their mission. They advocate for aspects of environmental protection, and the ones that do environmental protection are known as ENGOs. So the Nature Conservancy that you've probably heard of before is an example where they focus on accomplishing conservation objectives on the ground so that they're protecting rare species. The World Wildlife Fund for Nature, or Greenpeace, or the Population Connection. All of these attempt to shape policy through research, education, lobbying, and protest. So NGOs apply more funding and expertise to the environmental problems, and they conduct more research that's intended to solve them than other organizations do. So we take a look at globalization, and one of our goals is to make you think of environmental sustainability globally. And we have to make that world more interconnected because, as I said, what happens on one continent affects the climate, it affects the pollution, it affects the environment in other continents as well. And societies and ecosystems here are being changed at such unprecedented rates across the globe that we need to be aware of the impact of those changes. Trade and technology has been responsible for the increase in consumption of our resources. And if the U.S. citizens alone continue at the rate that they're going, it's going to take 2 planet Earths to meet their consumptive needs. So we have to look at the nations that exert the most incredible impacts, like the U.S., and make sure that they're following policy and they have things in place. So there are multinational corporations that operate outside the reach of the national laws. Some of those corporations, let me just pause for 1 minute. I'll be right back. Okay, so the multinational corporations, which I said operate outside the reach of the laws, they don't really have incentive to conserve the resources or to conduct their business sustainably in the nations where they operate. And for this, globalizing the world and organizations and institutions need to be able to shape international policy and need to become increasingly influential with this. So organizations and institutions also are vital in shaping that policy. Okay, so taking a look, here's approaches to environmental policies that you can see, and in this first picture it's identifying the problem that the pollution from this factory is harming the people's health. So what can be done? And the first step is the people can sue the factory in court, so they can seek their damages through court. If that doesn't work, then the next step is to go to the EPA and have the government regulate